I'm so glad you're here and joining us today. Your speakers are Tina Hand of CAHF and Paul P. Falkowski of Volunteer Leader, presenting their program for you all today, Robust Volunteer Programs, Facility-Wide Benefits, and Quality Improvement. Enjoy.
Hello, and welcome to our presentation on robust volunteer programs, facility-wide benefits, and quality improvement. I am Tina Hand. I am the project manager for the CAHF Volunteer Engagement Project. Thank you for joining us today. And I am joined today by Paul Falkowski. Paul, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I have been recruiting and training volunteers for about 28 years, so I'm thrilled to death to be part of this presentation and to have met Tina and to be working with her in a variety of ways. So I teach online courses in gerontology, and I also recruit and train volunteers for nursing homes. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Paul. Moving on to the next slide. I want to begin with a story. This is a true story about a resident in a skilled nursing facility, but I've changed names for privacy reasons. And this took place prior to COVID-19, so take a journey back in time with me. This is John. John had trouble with falls. He was prone to slipping in the hallway, in his room, and in group activities. Of course, the staff at his facility did all they could to try to mitigate these falls. But as you know, falls can happen for a lot of reasons, and nothing that the staff did seemed to be helping. The staff were concerned, and John was really frustrated. He became increasingly withdrawn from activities, and it was hard to even get him out of bed. And then a volunteer entered the picture. This is Sarah. Sarah is a young woman, only 19 years old, but when she came into the facility, she was determined to help John. Unlike the staff, Sarah was able to spend hours with John. She had spent time with other residents, but he was a tough case, and Sarah was determined she was going to help him. Sarah was incredibly patient with John. She didn't pressure him. She talked with him and listened. She tried to meet him where he was. When he was ready, she supported him, and they walked together. And her presence gave John hope. With her by his side, his falls became more and more infrequent. While Sarah was around, he was more steady, and eventually he felt confident enough to walk when Sarah wasn't even around. Since the time before John had met Sarah, his falls have drastically reduced. He's not as frustrated anymore, and Sarah is super proud of her friend. Next slide. What I want you to take away from this story and from our presentation overall today is that volunteers can change the experience in a skilled nursing facility. Volunteers have the time that facility staff don't always have. They may be able to spend more individual time with patients while staff can care for larger populations. Volunteers bring enthusiasm and a new perspective to the residents. Staff often speak of an energy shift when volunteers are in the building. The residents can feel that too, and it has a noticeable benefit to facility operations. Volunteers help to address the social and psychosocial needs of residents, which can help you as the facility staff to focus on other clinical needs. Next slide. I hope I'm not telling you anything that you don't already know. If you work in a skilled nursing facility, you likely already have a volunteer program, and you're familiar with some of these effects. But do you have a robust volunteer program? We found that there's a significant difference between a functional volunteer program and a robust volunteer program. We have found that a functional volunteer program can be unreliable. A functional volunteer program is probably only in the activities department, but a functional volunteer program can get by and can probably gather a really great group of volunteers for caroling during the holidays. Alternatively, we define a robust volunteer program as one that is successfully meeting the needs of the facility's residents and staff through a diverse group of committed volunteers. A robust volunteer program is well documented and sustainable, and it's even able to withstand turnover in its leadership. A robust volunteer program has established a reciprocal relationship with the volunteers where they feel devoted to doing service and appreciated for their efforts. A robust volunteer program is dynamic and perpetually attracting new volunteers to serve. A robust volunteer program is embedded within the facility operations and supplies an at-ready workforce for multiple departments. A robust volunteer program is undoubtedly better for residents and staff because it can create a more significant impact. A robust volunteer program is more likely to keep volunteers around and serving residents through human connection. And for that reason, all skilled nursing facilities need to have a robust volunteer program. You're going to hear me use that word a lot today, but it's really important. Your volunteer program needs to be robust and not just functional. And it's that idea that brought us to create the Volunteer Engagement Project. Next slide. So the Volunteer Engagement Project was developed in 2018 following the conclusion of another CAHF project, the Music and Memory Project. Music Memory was designed to engage residents in skilled nursing facilities through personalized music playlists. Music would be played to residents in person on their own personal MP3 players anytime that they were feeling anxious or upset or they just wanted some time to themselves. We discovered through that program that it was really dependent on volunteers and it wasn't really working that well when volunteers weren't available. Staff loved what the music did for the residents, but they didn't have time to make the playlists or update the devices or interview the residents about their tastes. So for this, they relied on volunteers. Frequently, skilled nursing facilities have volunteer programs, like I mentioned, but they're not maintained over a long period of time or between activity directors. One person will work to build up the program, but it will fall apart when they transition out of the facility. We learned that volunteer programs were suffering as a result of this instability. So CAHF conceived of the Volunteer Engagement Project. As an outside perspective, we were able to observe the state of volunteer programs in skilled nursing facilities and suggest improvements. We understood the challenges facilities face. We were able to create resources to meet unmet needs, and we could offer facilities more support than they may have had already. And volunteer programs are not just about playing music. The research proves that loneliness in this nursing home population, skilled nursing facilities in general, is a problem. Let me tell you about it in the next slide. So this is really our true goal in the Volunteer Engagement Project. It is to reduce loneliness and depression through volunteerism. There are countless articles and studies that have been done on the subject of loneliness and depression in seniors and those living in skilled nursing facilities. One study estimated that as many as 60% of senior citizens who live in a nursing home environment do not receive outside visitors. That's a problem. This can lead to sadness, boredom, depression, and a decline in health and cognition. In a 2012 study from the Archives of Internal Medicine, it was determined that among participants who were older than 60 years, loneliness was a predictor of functional decline and death. The psychological effects of having no visitors are really troubling. So that's really why we needed to work on this volunteer problem in skilled nursing facilities. And again, skilled nursing facilities have volunteer programs, but they're not as robust as they could be. And that's what we're really trying to do through our project. So in order to make an impact on residents to reduce loneliness and depression, we had to start with the facilities. Next slide. So the project started with a pilot program. We worked intensively with 20 facilities, 5 at a time for a period of 6 months. We are currently finishing our 4th group of 5 facilities. When we could, we visited them on site to observe their volunteer program and teach them about what we know about running a successful volunteer program. We also offered education to our pilot facilities. We had monthly support calls. We put webinars on every other month, covering specific topics related to volunteer programs in skilled nursing facilities. In fact, we just had one of our last webinars. It was about incorporating your volunteer program into the CAHF process. These webinars are free to access and open to anyone. We also sent a monthly newsletter with lots of useful insights that we had gathered throughout the project. And we created a few online videos to share some quick information about specific subjects like volunteer retention and staff interaction with volunteers. So we used our time in the Volunteer Engagement Project to create lasting resources that are available to anyone. Our mission is to help residents through volunteerism. In order to do this and to do the most good, we had to get our message out as much and as frequently as possible. But the resource that I think will be most enduringly helpful to facilities who want to build a robust volunteer program and feel the benefits of that throughout the facility is the handbook. Next slide. The handbook was created early on in the project as a collection of all of our research. Before we even started to work with the facilities in the pilot program, we wrote this handbook. It is a virtual step-by-step guide to building the kind of robust volunteer program that makes a difference. And we have been refining it and reshaping it throughout this process. So it's really functional. Facilities have already been using the information and resources found here. The first half of the handbook is all the explanations of how and why to start a robust volunteer program. And the second half is a lot of templates and other practical resources that people can use to build up their program. We designed this handbook to be applicable for someone who wants to start a volunteer program or someone who already has a pretty good one and they just want to take it to the next level. And in service to that, we're also offering this in Spanish and English by the end of our project. So it's really accessible for a wide population of people. Also, as a disclaimer, I want to say, if you're watching this outside of the state of California, the handbook was was written around California codes and regulations. So I recommend that you apply this information in another state by looking at your local and state regulations appropriate to whatever area you're in. Next slide. The final piece of the volunteer engagement project is a comprehensive how-to video, which is currently in production. The how-to video will act as a companion to the handbook. It's a little bit more fun and I won't say interesting because the handbook is also very interesting, but it's a different dynamic. The main intent is to articulate the value of a robust volunteer program to the facility staff and leadership. The residents already know how beneficial a volunteer program can be. The volunteers already know the impact and the good they can do through volunteering. We don't need to reiterate that. The people who make the decisions in the facility, the stakeholders, and the ones who are maintaining and supporting volunteer programs, those are the people we're trying to reach with this video. We understand that committing to building a robust volunteer program can seem daunting. We hope that this project and the resources we create will help ease some of that fear, and the video will really emphasize why it's important, why it's worth your investment. Plus, we're creating a little promo video that can serve as a marketing tool to try and get volunteers into your facility. What we've heard from people is that they have a great interest in building a volunteer program and they want to be able to market it, but they don't have a lot of time to market it. So we're going to put together almost like a little commercial for volunteering in SNFs, and it's going to be accessible and available to any skilled nursing facility in California to use in their marketing promotional information. So that's another great resource we put together. Next slide. So earlier this year, as we were working with a third group of our pilot program, facilities implemented visitor restrictions, as we're all aware of. COVID-19 has changed volunteer programs and how they operate. And for a minute, volunteers weren't serving in facilities at all. But that didn't last long because volunteers and volunteer programs are super resilient. So within a few weeks, volunteers adapted. They started connecting with residents through virtual means. And at the same time, volunteers were writing letters and making cards for residents in isolation. I even heard of one volunteer who was used to bringing her dog into the facility for pet visits, and she took a photo of her dog and included it in an individual card to every resident in their own rooms so that they could have a little piece of that experience, even in isolation. So I've been really impressed to see that how volunteer programs have adapted, and it just really illustrates to me how important these programs are to residents. We've never been more isolated. Even ourselves outside of skilled nursing facilities, we've never been more isolated. So communication and connection to other humans is really important. And I wasn't even aware of how important it was until COVID hit. So we're really grateful for the things that volunteers have done to try and support volunteer programs in skilled nursing facilities. Next slide. And this new method of connection of connecting to residents in isolation, I don't think it's going away anytime soon. Volunteers, especially older volunteers who've retired or feel a little bit, they're more in a high risk group, they may not be comfortable returning to health facilities anytime soon. So we're really excited that people have embraced these new methods of volunteering. And I really encourage everyone to keep trying to find new ways to connect residents to volunteers outside of the facility. They will enter the facility again. There will be a time when volunteers are back in person, but I think these new methods are here to stay. Next slide. So what we've learned through going through COVID and the volunteer engagement project in general is that skilled nursing facilities need ongoing support with their volunteer programs. We need to stay invested in volunteer programs, even when volunteerism looks different than it ever has before, like right now. We're working with facilities to try and keep them connected with their volunteers through regular communications. This is all to help residents. And right now, residents are isolated, like we all are. So we've put a lot into helping develop volunteer programs. And you may ask, Why is this so important? I may not have explained it enough or in quantifiable terms. So for that, I'm going to turn it over to Paul.
Thank you, Tina. You know, I've been at the business of recruiting and training volunteers for about 28 years, as I mentioned before. And over that time, I've learned a great deal from the people living and working in nursing homes. And along the way, people have asked me, so why are you such a strong advocate for volunteer programs in nursing homes? Well, here's a few of my reasons. Next slide. Well, let me start with Clarence. During one of my visits to a nursing home, I struck up a conversation with an older man, Clarence, and he told me he was 92 years old. And then he went on to say, to be human is to have someone to love and to be loved by someone. And as far as I can tell, I'm still human. Well, you know, when you hear things like that, it really makes you stop and pause and think about the way we treat older adults in the nursing homes. You know, if COVID-19 has taught us anything, it certainly has taught us how much we need to be in relationships with the people we love. We now have a clear understanding about the negative effects of social isolation. And if we didn't know before the pandemic, we certainly know now what happens when someone's need for relationship is not met. Next slide. Well, you might say, well, we have a lot of people in and around our community. Well, yes, that may be true, but how many of those people actually have time to nurture meaningful and authentic relationships with the people living there? A woman once said to me, you know, I have a lot of people around me, doctors and nurses and aides, but there's no one here just for me. So even in our best efforts, we still need to nurture relationships that go deeper than just small talk. You could be surrounded by 80,000 people at a football stadium and feel very alone when you can't find your ride home. You can just ask me. What happens when people feel disconnected and alone? Next slide. One day I received a telephone call, and from the caller ID, I saw that it was coming from Kansas City, about 300 miles from my location. And when I answered the telephone, a woman, Marty, introduced herself and explained that her father, Maury, was living in a nursing home in my area and that there was no family in that area to visit him. She asked if I had a volunteer that would visit Maury. Well, I immediately thought of one of my veteran volunteers, Bill. Bill had been volunteering for 10, 15 years, and I called him and I explained the situation. He went to the nursing home where Maury was living, and later Bill would tell me that Maury was more alert and his mood had greatly improved and that he was getting beat royally by Maury in card games every week. Their relationship continued for 2 more years, and their daughter was absolutely ecstatic over how much her father had improved. Bill became a part of their family. Next slide. As for staff, well, many times I've heard nursing home staff tell me how much they appreciate the volunteers we're sending them. They tell me they're reliable, they're trustworthy, and they allow me to go about other tasks, knowing that our residents will be safe with a volunteer. Next slide. Well, this is Andrew Samuels, and he's one of what I call our super volunteers. I asked him how his time in the nursing home had impacted him. And he thought for a moment, and then he said, well, spending this time with the people in the nursing home has changed me. I have a new outlook on life. I hug my wife a little more. I talk to my children a little differently. You know, personally, from my own experience, prior to going into a nursing home, I never gave much thought to my ending. But, and I believe this is not unique to me, my early volunteer days in the nursing home caused me to confront my mortality and to think, how am I using my time? You know, how many people working in long-term care today started out as volunteers? I don't know the exact number, but my guess is a lot. But you know, there's another reason why I'm so adamant about expanding the role of volunteers in nursing homes. And that's because your volunteers become ambassadors, recruiters, and they even take paid positions like CNA or other jobs in the nursing home. They go back to their workplaces, their churches, their friends, and their family, and they say, come and see. This is a place where you can make a real difference. Volunteers learn about the aging process, and they begin to understand the negative effects of ageist thinking. They make new friends, just as I did. I met some remarkable people over the years, like Elizabeth, who was a woman's air service pilot during World War II. She was 89 when I met her. She's qualified to fly 39 different kinds of aircraft, to include B-17s, P-36s, and helicopters. Where do you find stories like that? Some of our volunteers from an international corporation began sharing their experiences back at their workplace. Word got to their CEO, and he saw the impact that the volunteer experience was having on them. And so he offered to pay his employees to go through training and then paid for their time while they volunteered at the nursing home. That was incredible. But that's the power of a well-designed and sustainable volunteer program. Next slide. So why? Because a vibrant and sustainable, well-managed volunteer workforce will positively impact nearly every aspect of your community, including your star rating. Both my dissertation and a study that I'm involved in currently reveals that nursing homes with a strong volunteer workforce, where volunteers are engaging residents in personalized activities, are using less drugs, fewer falls, fewer UTIs, and so on. Next slide. So for my dissertation, this is just sort of an end graph that I put together showing the relationship between quality measures and the activities in which volunteers were engaged. And so using some sophisticated analysis and so on, nursing homes that were using their volunteers to provide personalized activities were positively associated with a quality measure of nurse hours per patient day, while nursing homes that were depending on large group activities were negatively associated with the quality measures of nurse hours per patient day. Now, I realize that these results are not conclusive, but a follow-on study that I am now involved in is showing similar results. So working with two of my colleagues from the University of Nebraska, we surveyed 52 nursing homes. We collected data on the nursing home characteristics, the characteristics of the volunteer program. We merged their data with 7 quality measures: pressure sores, falls, UTIs, use of restraints, use of antipsychotics, and hypnotic drugs. We hypothesized that these 7 quality measures might be most likely to be influenced by volunteer activities. The results of the regression analysis are shown here, where volunteers were providing personalized activities such as doing hair and nails, providing intergenerational contact, providing meal assistance. There was less use of antipsychotic and hypnotic drugs. Likewise, there's a lower incident rate for UTIs where volunteers are involved in other duties. Other duties were like a catch-all for activities that were not specified in the survey, such as folding towels or wiping tables, things like that. There were similar relationships for the other quality measures, but they weren't statistically significant. However, they did show a similar inverse relationship, and that's encouraging. What is needed now is a large-scale study so that those relationships can be better analyzed. We have submitted an article to the Journal of Applied Gerontology with our results, and we're continuing to analyze data. So the idea here is this: volunteers are impacting quality measures and ultimately your CMS star rating. Well, with that, I'll turn the presentation back over to Tina.
Thanks, Paul. So I'm hoping that you're kind of coming on board with the idea that having a robust volunteer program is hugely impactful for your facility, both in terms of your quality measures and just the experience of being in your facility overall. So now we can talk about how you achieve the similar results in your facility. We've come up with a couple of fundamental elements of a volunteer program. First, I want to introduce to you James. This is James. He's a volunteer at a facility in Southern California. He has been volunteering for this facility for a number of years, but his introduction to volunteering was not all that great. After a period of visiting a loved one in the hospital, James became interested in volunteering to spend time with people in health facilities. He reached out to hospitals and skilled nursing facilities to try to volunteer. Hospitals would thank him for his interest and direct him to their long application process. Skilled nursing facilities would express gratitude that he called, but he would never hear back. So it was a welcome surprise when he met a man who had been volunteering to cut hair in a skilled nursing facility. James was so shocked. "How did you get in to volunteer? I've been trying and nothing's worked." And the volunteer said, "You go through the activity director." Oh, James did not know where to turn when he felt like he wasn't getting any traction. So he finally went to the activity director. He called the facility and asked to speak directly with her. She was thrilled that he was interested. She sent him an application through email. He completed it shortly thereafter and continued to communicate with him directly. So he was able to move the process along with her help. Today, James volunteers every week. He has built and maintained relationships with residents, and he plans to continue volunteering as long as he can because it feeds his soul. He feels entirely fulfilled by his service. In 2019, James was even selected as CAHF's Adult Volunteer of the Year. Next slide. So James is an exceptionally dedicated volunteer in skilled nursing facilities. He's been doing it for years. He will do it for years to come. But even he was almost lost due to poor communication. That's why communication is one of the 5 areas that we consider to be fundamental to a robust volunteer program. The other areas include recruitment, orientation and training, policy, and assessment and recognition. Let's talk a little bit more about each of these areas and why they're so fundamental. Next slide, please. So if you want volunteers to serve in your facility, you're probably going to have to recruit them. Recruitment starts with understanding your facility's needs and wants for your volunteer program. First, you need to know what is your capacity for volunteers. For many facilities, the answer to this question is as many as we can get, and that's awesome. But for others, maybe you can only accommodate 3 or 4 volunteers. You need to define how many volunteers your facility wants to recruit and think of things like training and orientation, resident interest, your current volunteers, your available staff to support the program, even things like parking. These are all the limiting factors that may prevent you from being able to take on as many volunteers as you want. Without this kind of pre-planning, you could end up in a situation where more volunteers are coming in than you know what to do with, which can lead to a bad experience for your volunteers. It can cause a loss of interest in new volunteers or existing volunteers, and it can make it hard to recruit in the future. Once you understand how many volunteers you want, you got to think about what types of volunteers you want. Maybe you want young people or older adults who are closer in age to many of your residents. So maybe you want families or veterans. Maybe you have your eye on a specific group of volunteers that you think could be really impactful for the residents in your facility. Maybe that group is a religious group. These are just some of the types of volunteers that you can have serving in your facility. And you want to think about whether or not your residents want one-on-one interaction or group interactions. Right now, the answer to that question is going to probably be one-on-one interactions because of COVID. But when things go back to normal, it could be different. The Volunteer Engagement Project Handbook has some role descriptions that are helpful in defining what different roles of your volunteer program may be, whether that is leading a group activity or one-on-one, or maybe even a volunteer coordinator that's a volunteer. So there's lots of different help in there. And this is, again, where you want to be working with your residents and the rest of your staff to understand what people want to get out of the volunteer program. You really want to take it outside of the activities department or the volunteer department and bring it to the people. You want to know what they want so you can deliver it. You can also tailor your recruitment strategies to areas where these people may be at. So if it's youth volunteers you're trying to recruit, obviously you want to post some flyers at school. And if you want to recruit more generally, you just want to make sure that you're making a broad effort to try and recruit people. So you could try lots of different approaches. Some ideas that we've learned through the Volunteer Engagement Project that have been successful include posting flyers at local colleges and even getting in touch with professors that may be speaking or teaching about related topics like gerontology. We also worked with an activity director who accompanied the director of marketing to a healthcare expo to advertise her volunteer program, and she got a lot of interest. Lots of facilities advertise volunteer opportunities through local church bulletins, and social media offers a huge opportunity for recruitment. You could even ask one of your younger volunteers if they want to take that on as a part of their recruitment or as a part of their service. They can do the recruiting for you. And also, don't forget to utilize current volunteers. You can ask them to tell their friends about the program and to tell their family. The chances are they maybe know someone that might be interested in volunteering as well. The thing is there that you need to create a volunteer program that people really want to brag about, but we're going to help you do that. And then recruitment is really one area of volunteer programs where you can be as creative as you want. This is just about getting people interested and excited. Honestly, the more creative, the better. I bet if you made a couple of TikTok videos right now, you'd get a lot of interest. Personally, I know I would be interested. Next slide. And recruitment doesn't need to be hard. This is something that you can work at a little every day or a few times a week, but it should be a consistent effort. And everyone on your staff has a part to play in this process. Like with your current volunteers, everyone on your staff has family, they all have friends, maybe they do some volunteering of their own, but they can be a representative of your volunteer program to the larger community. And that can be really beneficial when you're trying to recruit people into your volunteer program. So if you want to build your volunteer program, you need to deputize the rest of your staff in the building. And there's a lot of really easy ways to do that. So just make sure that you are creative in that as well. So next slide. The next thing we definitely want to work on is orientation and training. Next slide. This is another fundamental part of your volunteer program. The orientation process is how you introduce volunteers to your facility, the staff, the residents, the policies, the building. It just gets them comfortable. Orientation is a way of getting them into your environment and feeling like they can actually do service because they know their way around. But it's also important to establishing a strong volunteer program. Without orientation, volunteers can feel unsure, unsupported, unhappy, and unlikely to return. Orientation may just fall on the shoulders of the activity director or the volunteer manager, but it's recommended that you include other staff as well. This gives your volunteers more points of contact in the environment. If they can't find you, maybe they can find someone else who they've already met on staff. If you've ever heard me talk on the subject, you may know this suggestion already, but I'm totally in favor of establishing a volunteer mentorship program. If you could have more established volunteers help the less established volunteers, it again creates more points of contact within the facility, so people are getting more connection and more support, more of these sticking points that make it a little bit harder for them to just walk away when they're feeling unsure or maybe a little scared in the volunteer program. So I'm all in favor of that. Next slide. In talking with volunteers and SNFs and doing the research through this project, we've learned that training is most commonly cited as the reason why volunteers choose to serve at one facility or another. If your facility has a comprehensive volunteer training process, that will recruit volunteers in and of itself. Training can take many different forms. There's online or in person. Maybe you'll do the training or the DSD will. There's lots of different ways to do it, but there are some regulations to put into place mandating how volunteers are trained in California, and also just under the federal mandate. So, you can click, please. Section 483.95 lumps volunteers in with employees in the subjects they need to be trained on. What is different is that volunteers are required to be trained consistent with their expected roles. So you need to understand what's expected of your volunteer and then to be able to train them accordingly. We recommend that you train on all of these topics. As you can see, there's a lot of subjects that need to be covered, but this is for the benefit of everyone involved. If you want to be able to feel comfortable with your volunteers in your facility environment, then you need to be able to make sure that they know these things. And for many volunteers, this is their first time in a healthcare facility, so you're doing your job to also make them feel comfortable and interested in sticking around. Unlike employees, volunteers are not required to be trained on any one area for any specific amount of time. Volunteers don't need 6 hours of training on dementia, for example, but they probably need more than 15 minutes. So again, it's responsible that you consider the needs of your facility and your residents when deciding how long to focus on each of these areas. But every volunteer in your volunteer program needs to be trained in all of these areas. And one more note, we just recommend that you make sure that volunteers and staff are trained separately. They're going to get a lot of the same information, but we want it to be crystal clear that volunteers are not to be doing a lot of the duties that are ultimately assigned to staff, like bathing residents or feeding residents. We want to help mitigate any trouble there by making it crystal clear that volunteers are just there for the psychosocial needs of residents. Next slide. Just as a note, background checks have come up a lot during our process with the volunteer engagement project. There has been a couple of questions about whether or not background checks are required. According to the California Code of Regulations, they're not required for volunteers unless a volunteer is directly supervised. Oh, excuse me, I misspoke. They are required for volunteers unless the volunteer is directly supervised by someone who's already had a background check. The volunteer is never left alone with the patients. The volunteer does not provide any client assistance with dressing, grooming, bathing, personal hygiene. So my assumption is that they're not helping with those things anyway, but you might want to leave a volunteer alone with your residents. That being said, I know that you're all doing the best you can to care for your residents in a safe and comfortable environment. So most of you are already doing background checks anyways. I just wanted to make a note of it. It is required unless they're not being left alone. And we do recommend it. Unfortunately, there are no free background check resources online, but there are now available background checks that are exclusively online, so people don't even have to leave their home. So that's a nice resource. Next slide. Okay, so once you've done the recruitment, the orientation, the training, you want to make sure that your volunteers are understanding of your policy. That's why it's another fundamental part of your volunteer program. Next slide. Just like every other part of your skilled nursing facility, the volunteer program needs to be documented well in your policies. Does your facility allow for volunteers under the age of 18? Are volunteers allowed to give residents water? Are volunteers allowed to take a picture with a resident, post it on their social media? Who knows? Your policy knows. All of these issues should be outlined in your policy, and the policy should be given to each volunteer in your program. It's not doing any good when it's filed away and not repeatedly accessed when volunteers have questions. So make sure that your policy is up to date, that it is reflective of the volunteer program that you have in place, that it's approved by obviously your administrator and all of the leadership in your facility. We just want to make sure that volunteers have all the information they need to be successful. And having a policy in place makes them feel more comfortable in what can be kind of an unpredictable environment. So that's why policy is really significant and really fundamental to your volunteer program. Next slide. Earlier, I mentioned that the volunteer engagement project was conceived during the Music and Memory Project. The need for this help was so clear because volunteer programs were struggling all over the state. And do you know what would most often take down a volunteer program? It was a lack of policy. Next, click, thank you. I know it sounds so silly, but some paperwork can stop a program that is built on human connection, and it can just stop it right in its tracks. Click, please. But these volunteer programs were residing in the heads of the people that had built them. They hadn't been written down. And then when that person walked away, the volunteer program went with them. And then the next person had to come in and build it all up again. So having well-documented policy is really important for the sustainability of your project, of your volunteer engagement, for your volunteer program. And that's something we've learned through the volunteer engagement project. Next slide. Even beyond just documentation, written policies are, in fact, the only thing that is really keeping your volunteer program going long term, right? So superstar volunteers will make a huge difference, more of an impact for sure, but policy is really the thing that's keeping the wheels on the bus so we can keep moving. Next slide. James's story earlier showed how a lack of communication can destroy a volunteer program. That's why we consider it to be a fundamental part of your volunteer program. Next slide. Communication applies to a lot of your volunteer program. So sorry, this has 3 more clicks to make this animate correctly. This has to do with how you recruit volunteers and you keep them engaged. So first of all, what's the impression when they're walking into the facility? You want to make sure that they are being called back as soon as possible, that they are getting the application that they need, and that they're being responded to, because as James demonstrated, that can be really discouraging. Next, you want to make sure that you're communicating while they're doing their volunteer service. Do they understand what's expected of them? Are they getting the support they need? Do you take time to let them ask questions and give direction and stuff like that? And then finally, communication with volunteers becomes really important when they're not in the facility. That's particularly effective right now, or appropriate to what's happening right now, when a lot of your volunteers are maybe not in the facility in person or not volunteering at all. So it's important to maintain that connection, because you don't want to lose people that you have already trained and establish relationships with residents just because you weren't keeping in touch with them. So doing, a weekly email or text check-in is really significant. Next slide. And as far as communication, emailing, texting, sending cards through the mail, these are all great ways to do it. We just recommend that you check with each individual volunteer to see what method they prefer. And then you make sure that you communicate in that way. That shows that you're listening to them, that you respect them, and that you want to keep in touch. Next slide. And then the last thing that's so fundamental is appreciation and recognition. Next slide. So before you recognize your volunteers, we also need to assess what's happening. We need to know how your volunteers are doing and how your volunteer program is progressing. So that's why we encourage you to do that in an ongoing basis. Assessment can take many forms. Maybe you're walking around your volunteers when they're doing their service. Maybe you're checking in with them through a survey or an in-person interview. And the truth is there's lots of different ways to do it, just like we've mentioned a few times already. So we offer lots of different ways that you can do that in the Volunteer Engagement Project Handbook. And we have a couple different suggestions for that. We really encourage you to just check in with your staff and your residents, pull them into this process. What do they like about the volunteer program? What do they like about the specific volunteers? And what suggestions do they have to make it better? Next slide. We have this work plan in the handbook. I won't jump into it too much, but it's really great for defining a goal and then watching how that goal progresses. It helps to keep you on track. Next slide. And then finally, recognition. This is so hugely important with your volunteers. Since volunteers are doing service without pay, without anything expected in return, we just ask that you make sure to say thank you and that you invite all of the people in your facility to join into that effort. It's really special if a resident can make a card that says thank you to your volunteers. It's really awesome if everyone on staff can stop and say thank you when they see them. This really makes them feel part of the team, which is another way that volunteers can feel appreciated. They feel like they're making a real difference. It's great if you can customize your recognition to your volunteers' interests. If they're a shy person, it's probably not going to be awesome to sing a song publicly from your residents. But if they're a really outgoing person, maybe that's exactly the way they want to be recognized. And then make sure that you're doing it consistently. Next slide. So this is a great way to recognize volunteers once a year through a holiday event, or this facility made custom fudge for their volunteers, and that's awesome. But we just want to make sure you're doing it throughout the year as well. Don't just leave it for the end of the year. Next slide. And with that, I'm actually going to throw it back to Paul for his next section.
Okay, thanks, Tina. Well, before I get into this topic, I need to tell you about two books that I would really believe you should have at your desk. The first one is From the Top Down by Susan Ellis. She provides a step-by-step guide for developing a volunteer workforce that is fully integrated into the operations of your facility. And then the partner book by Betty Stallings, Leading the Way to Successful Volunteer Involvement. They're full of worksheets, checklists, assessments, and a lot of other how-to tools. And so anyway, a lot of what I'm about to share comes from those books. And there's just so much I could say about creating a sustainable volunteer workforce. I feel like I'm about to describe the entire universe to you in about 4 slides. Anyway, here come the main themes that I want to stress to you. Next slide. There's an old saying that you can't save the church from the pew. Well, meaning that lasting and sustainable change has to start with and be fully embraced by those people in leadership. There has to be a vision of what the volunteer workforce will look like, what they will do, and the impact that they'll have on all of the stakeholders in the organization. And this starts with developing a statement of philosophy, starting with your philosophy about volunteers, and then gathering feedback from the board of directors, your staff, the family of the residents themselves, and even your veteran volunteers. And answer the question, why do we want volunteers? What value do they bring to our community? And what do we want volunteers to do? You know, your community statement of philosophy should express your community's commitment to volunteers, and that volunteers are a vital partner working side by side with your paid staff to provide excellent quality of care and quality of life. Your statement of philosophy will communicate to your volunteers their value to the community. That statement should be well publicized throughout the organization through orientation, staff trainings, staff meetings, bulletin boards, posters, social media, newsletters. There should be no mistake about your organization's commitment to the volunteer workforce. And you'll notice that I'm not saying volunteer program at this point. It's not a program, it's a workforce that works right alongside your paid workforce. Next slide. You know, I know it's common to delegate the responsibility of managing volunteers to the activities or life enrichment department, but to really have a sustainable workforce, I believe it's really necessary to have someone that has had formal training in the management of volunteers. Managers of volunteers know how to help you develop your philosophy statement, develop job descriptions, assess risk, develop policies, and recruit, interview, train, and provide ongoing training, because research shows that volunteers want to grow in their experience, and then conduct evaluations of both the volunteers and the effort itself, as well as communicate with leadership through reports and impact statements. And oh yeah, not to mention, bring a great communicator to represent you to the public. They are the ones who will have the skill to fully integrate your volunteers and your paid staff into a cohesive and dynamic workforce. Your manager of volunteers, next slide, sorry. Your manager of volunteers will know how to create job descriptions that will involve everyone on your paid staff through surveys, focus groups, and even one-on-one interviews. And asking, how can volunteers help us meet our organization's goals? What are the needs of the staff? Where can volunteers support staff? What are our volunteers, what can they do for the residents? And how can we support them? How do our job descriptions fit into the strategic plan? You know, your manager of volunteers should be a participating member in your strategic planning. And with your job descriptions in hand, now it's time to develop your training. Next slide. So what is training? Next slide. Well, let's start by saying what it's not. Training is not endless, boring PowerPoint slides packed with text that's barely readable. And it's not an opportunity for the trainer to impress you with what they know. It's not your onboarding process either. That should have already happened. And you should have a pretty good idea of who your trainees are before you get to the point of training. So what is training? Next slide. Training is more than just passing on information. It's an active exchange of ideas between the trainer and the trainee. It's teamwork. It's engaging the trainee through asking questions, soliciting feedback, offering opportunities to practice new skills, and then finally possessing the training tools necessary to make the training process active and a positive experience. It's a shared experience between you and the people you're training. Next slide. Well, the first thing to do in developing job descriptions, or excuse me, training topics, is to do the research. Go to your organization's documents, search the internet, look for articles about the topic, involve everyone in the process, get their feedback, and they will know what the volunteer has been trained in, and that will give them a sense of comfort. I would even conduct one-on-one interviews, and then finally distill everything that you've learned down into an outline and then put it into a logical and digestible manner. It's not an easy process, but it's well worth the effort so that your training presentation of your content is well thought out and the presentation is logical. Finally, evaluation. This is huge. How well is the volunteer workforce doing what they said that they would do? How well are they meeting goals and strategic plans? What are we doing well? Where do we need to improve? What's the return on our investment? And all of the stakeholders should have input into this. And SurveyMonkey is a wonderful way to take the temperature of both your paid and volunteer workforce. And in doing this, it communicates that you value your workforce input and feedback. It may even uncover some problems that are simmering that you don't know about. Well, I'm out of breath. Back to you, Tina.
Thanks, Paul. So we've explained how volunteer programs benefit the whole facility, how they affect quality. We've addressed some of the fundamentals and the best ways to get everyone involved. So before we close for today, I want to address a few common challenges that I call opportunities for growth. Next slide. The most common issue we've discussed a few times, but it bears repeating. This is the issue when the volunteer program is siloed in the activities department. Volunteer programs can function when siloed, but they're not as sustainable, not as strong, nor as effective as those that are integrated into the entire facility. So what we recommend instead, next slide, is that the activities department can function as a point of entry for volunteers. Volunteers can be trained and oriented in the activities department, next slide. And then they can serve within other departments. So the activities department is still collecting them, but then they're sending them out to work in other areas of the facility. This can increase your volunteer satisfaction because they're given choices to serve in ways that are more fitting for their interests. Plus, residents will be able to interact with volunteers in so many more ways. They can eat with them and see them at the front desk. It's going to add a lot of energy to your facility. Next slide. The next opportunity for growth is recruitment. A common misconception is that recruitment is a one-time thing. It's not. It's ongoing. It's something that you should be working at all the time, because if you run a skilled nursing facility volunteer program, you are aware of the fact that volunteers come and go. And that's not a failure of you or your volunteer program. It is normal. It is just the nature of volunteer service work. So we recommend that you're constantly looking for ways to grow your volunteer program, that you're always looking to recruit, and that you take special times of the year, like the holidays, when you might have more volunteers, to actually grow your volunteer program. Maybe if someone was caroling during the holidays, you could invite them to start a karaoke group during the everyday. So there are opportunities, and your recruitment should always be a part of your volunteer program. And the next opportunity, next slide, is just reflective of this moment. I've seen quite a few people that are not engaging in virtual or remote volunteer opportunities, and I think that there is something missed there. Just don't shy away from these opportunities, because so many people are at home and looking for ways to serve their community. I posted an ad for virtual volunteering, for example, and I received 10 responses in 24 hours, and I was honestly shocked. These were people from across the United States who are interested in helping isolated residents in California skilled nursing facilities. So I encourage you to take this opportunity for growth and really embrace these new forms of volunteer service. And with that, next slide, we have come to the sprint of our presentation. We are so grateful for your attendance at today's session. We hope you learned something about volunteer programs and the effects that they have on your entire facility and your quality measures. There's a significant difference that can be had when you embrace this and really build a robust volunteer program. Go beyond the functional, go beyond the bare minimum, and really try to build something up here. So thank you very much.